Thanks for that, Jess. I'm hoping and presuming that everybody can hear me okay. I have to say I'm still reeling from your wedding dramas from this year. It sounds absolutely brutal, but yeah. Moving on. I'm going to start by sharing the slides from today. So let me just do that. Perfect. And yeah, I guess I had a really interesting phone call with Jess at the start of this process to sort of explain the purpose of the conference and the opportunity that there would be to talk to you guys around some of the lessons that we've learned in sport, and then potentially transferring those across to some lessons that can be learned within the utilities space. And on first, it probably feels like it's not the smoothest of fits, but actually more thinking about it, I think there's potentially lots to be discussed and learn. And I kind of, yeah, from my point of view, it's a great opportunity to be able to discuss some of these ideas from people outside of the bubble that I work in, and gain some insights and thoughts from elsewhere. So yes, I must confess I have a lot of slides to get through, and I know I've got a relatively strict timeline of 30 minutes. So I will move on into the presentation. So a bit of background. So Jess has already said a few bits about me, which was very nice to hear. A bit more detail, I guess, from my technical background. So I started off as an engineer and moved into sport via biomechanics. So kind of the integration of biology, biological systems and mechanics. I did that at Liverpool John Moores University, and then also a PhD at Brunel University. And throughout that whole time, really, I was also working as part of the UK sport Olympic and Paralympic system, which essentially provides the science and technology services to the athletes that are hoping to go to the Olympic or Paralympic Games. More recently in my career, I sort of moved into science and technology leadership roles. So that started off at British Cycling, where it's the head of performance support, which is the science and technology arm of that team. And then again, more recently, I moved into a very similar role within Team INEOS, and now we're, as we are known as INEOS Grenadiers. And so to expand on that a little bit more and what performance support means in my world, is really captured by these three themes. So we've got human science, we've got engineering, and we've got data and analytics.
Paul,
and performance.
Sorry to interrupt, Paul. You haven't shared your slides yet. Would you be able to press the share screen button back on the on the conference page?
Oh dear, look at that, guys. I had one job to do. So allow. Oh, wonderful. Right. Is that any better?
They're just appearing for me. Yes, perfect. Okay.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, guys. Right, there we go. Wonderful. First technological glitch, but we'll see if we can move on. There you go. So that was for those that didn't see, there was the first slide. There's the second slide. Some old pictures of me where I look frighteningly young. And I'll move on to this, which is the slide that I was talking through. So yeah, human science, engineering, and data and analytics. And the specific topic that when I was speaking to Jess, that I thought it'd be useful for us to discuss further, or for me to expand upon further, is our use of simulations, as we would call it, or digital twins. And digital twins or simulations for us occupy all three elements of here. So there's elements of biology and human science, there's elements of equipment and engineering, and there's clearly an element of data and analytics as well. So to expand on that a little bit further, what do I mean by a simulation, or what does a simulation mean in our world? Well, really, it's a simplified version of reality that's used to explore and understand a system. So we're looking to try to capture the essence of a system in a set of rules to then help us to try and explore the system. Now, the rules in our world could be either physics driven, they could be physiology driven, or they could simply be logic driven. So physics and physiology is pretty straightforward in terms of cycling. So we're governed by the laws of physics in terms of how fast a rider or a bike and rider system will move through the air. We're also governed to an extent by physiology, so how much power and force the human body can produce, and we can capture that in a set of rules. And then there's also logic, which outside of the world of cycling, for example, there's plenty of simulations that are used, for example, in team sports, where you're looking at maybe a tactical approach that one team might take, and that is often captured through what's known as agent-based models, where each of the agents, so each of the players on the team, would have a set of tactical rules that they would adhere to, and so in many ways that's a simulation it's driven through logic rather than necessarily physics or physiology. So down on the bottom right of this slide, you can see how that works in our world. So we have in the middle our cyclist, and we basically try to simplify that system just into a box that has a power output that's produced on one side, and then a set of resistances that are produced on the other side. And we try and simplify the cyclist into this model, and then we can try and explore the system using that. So to expand a little bit more in terms of those inputs, so the power and then also the resistances. So on the resistance side, how would we capture this type of information? So we would, if we wanted to describe the aerodynamic properties of the rider, we would, for example, spend some time in a wind tunnel. If we wanted to understand the rolling resistance that was occurring between the tyre and the surface that the rider was pedaling over, we would do some rolling resistance testing, so down on the bottom. And then we could have a look at how those two things combine in terms of some track testing, which is what's happening here. So we'd capture some information using an instrumented bike, where we would put on sensors and what have you onto a bike, and collect that information and try to refine our model. But these are kind of the data sources that we would use to define the resistances that the rider has to overcome. And then from a power output point of view, we would we use instrumentation on the bike to measure how much power a rider would produce, and then we would try to simplify that to generate some rules to say, okay, if a rider is pedaling at a certain cadence or at a certain speed, our expectation is that they would produce this much power. And so we can essentially describe in simple terms and simplify what we think the power output input that a rider would produce would be. So once we have that, and I guess this is the key point really of the use of a simulation in our world, is you then, once we have that tool available, we can then use that to explore the system to gain insights. So on the right hand side here, just this graph that I've got here, we've got the 3 different potential areas that we could choose to change on a bike. So we could choose to try and change the aerodynamic drag, which is in blue. We could choose to try and change the mass of either the rider through maybe a nutritional intervention, or the bike itself through an equipment intervention. And then we could also, and that's in red. And then the last parameter that we could choose to change is rolling resistance, which is the essentially the energy lost through the tyre and the road interface. So we could choose to try and invest time and effort into that as well. And before we went on the journey to try and reduce or to change any of those properties, we can and we do use a simulation to understand where our time and efforts are best spent. So as you can see here, we're pretty simple. We've just got a percentage change in the parameter. So if we were to increase the parameter by 10%, is on this side, and if we were to reduce it by 10%, it's all the way on over to this side. And then on the vertical axis, we've got the change in the performance. So for us, this is in terms of time. And so we've got here the predicted, so the simulated change in performance time if we were to alter any one of these 3 parameters in the system. And as you can see from the graph, it's pretty clear that if we had an amount of time or an amount of resource that we were choosing to spend to try to optimize any of those 3 areas, in this instance, we should be looking at trying to reduce aerodynamic drag. So by comparison, we could reduce mass or rolling resistance in this context by 10%, and the actual change that we would expect to see on the system as a whole is pretty small. And by comparison, even a 2% reduction in drag in this context would have a significant impact on the system performance. And so that's one of the ways in which we would use simulations or digital twins, is essentially to do a sensitivity analysis of the system that we're looking at to try and understand where we would place our money, where we're going to get maximum bang for buck. To expand on that a little bit more, we could also use, or we do use simulations to try and understand our best equipment selection, or our best equipment setup for a given rider for a given stage. So here we've got, and on the left and on the right, 2 different stages from one of the Grand Tours from this season. So as you can see, just visually inspecting the different profiles, that they're quite different. The one on the left is predominantly either downhill or flat, and then on the right hand side we've got a number of pretty significant mountain passes. Now, the riders have the option or have the choice of quite a range of equipment. And when I say quite a range of equipment, I really do mean quite a large range of equipment. So here are all of the potential helmet choices that are available to the rider. So we've got 13 there in total. Now, as you can probably tell, I am slightly exaggerating for effect, because there's at least a couple of these which are BMX helmets, which although would be perfectly legal to use in a road race, highly unlikely that someone's going to do that. But you take the point, I hope, that there's a lot of different options here in terms of helmets. Now we would have information in terms of the aerodynamic properties of that helmet, in terms of the weight of that helmet. But what we need to do is try to use, or to have a strategy to turn the information and the data on those individual components into a performance outcome that we can say, well, this is the helmet that you should use, and or this is the helmet that you should use. To expand on the point further, if we look at tires, and this is straight off the website, so it's a kind of this is kind of available to everyone to have a look at. We use Continental tires for our tire choice. We have 28 types of tires that are available to the riders to use on a given course. And now, if you then have, for each tire, there is potentially probably 3 or 4 different wheel options that we could also run. You can see that when you add all of that together, there's an enormous, there's a very large range of options that are available to us. And the key point here is that, taking all of this together, why do we choose to use a simulation in this point? Why do we choose to use a digital twin? It's because time and resource is obviously limited for everyone. And in particular, it's probably fair to say that time is a particularly rare commodity in elite sport. So if we were able to piece together an experimental approach where we would do some field testing to define which of the 13 helmets is best and which of the 100 combinations of wheel and tire options is best, that's a huge amount of work and effort that probably isn't worth it, and we probably should just refer back to which the riders would prefer to use. Now, by comparison, if we have our simulation, we have our digital twin up and running, we can use that as a key tool to try and understand which of the equipment options that we've got should we use for any given race or for any given profile. And what we would choose to do at that point is then probably to follow up with some actual experimental approaches, which I'll come on to in a bit. But there's a huge body of work that can be done very efficiently, very effectively in a virtual world, that's going to give us some really good insight into how we could prioritize the work that we do. Okay, so on to something completely unrelated to cycling, and I must confess, so I spent a number of years across a range of different Olympic and Paralympic sports. It never included figure skating, but at the same time, whilst most of my work in the past and currently is in cycling, I am also massively intrigued by other sports and how other sports approach the problems of high performance in sport. A really, really good example of that is some of the work that was done in figure skating, and it's quite a few years ago, and it's from a University of Delaware. But I think it's a really good example of how simulation can really fast track the development of a performance. So what's the problem that we're trying to solve? Well, in figure skating, there's a massive requirement to do jumps with a significant number of rotations. I think in this instance they were trying to do four rotations as part of the jump, a very high skill level, and if you can land it, it puts you in a very competitive position for a medal position. The issue with that is obviously it's not straightforward, and how do you accelerate someone's learning of how to acquire that skill? So traditionally today, in figure skating, as you would expect in most sports, there's a lot of trial and error. There's a lot of experience and knowledge that surrounds the performer, but it's not necessarily data-driven or evidence-based in a sense. It's more intuitive and experience-led, and which is a very clear role for that to play. But the guys at University of Delaware had a thought of how they could improve this process. And the way they improved this process was essentially through a simulation. Now, the way that they approached this performance question was to simplify the system. So they simplified the figure skater into a stick figure. So you can see there the little dots that are on on the figure skater, and then you can see that they're on the boots at the top as well. And these retroreflective markers work with a 3D motion capture system and will generate a stick figure. So you can see that in the picture at the bottom. And this stick figure is generated that captures the main movements that the athlete would produce. Now, what they then did was used a physics-driven model. So coming back to the point at the start, it is physics-driven. And they tried to predict, using the stick figure information, how successful or not a jump would be, or how many rotations they would be able to do. And then crucially, they then built in the capacity to ask what-if questions. So, okay, so this is how you currently jump. What would happen if you put your arms a little bit further out? What would happen if you put your wrists a little bit further in? And they created a virtual world that the coaches and that the athletes could explore potential applications or potential changes to their technique to try and achieve the jumps. And this is what they did. So you can see on the left-hand side of this little short video is the sort of the baseline or the current jumping technique, and on the right you can see a modified technique that they've used the simulation to identify a posture that is more likely to be successful. And it's a pretty simple intervention. You can see that if you look closely, that the elbows are slightly closer together on the figure on the right hand side, which makes sense from a physics perspective, that the segments are closer to the center of rotation, but it's a really powerful tool to work with a coach and the athletes to try and explore what this might be. And obviously it would be different for different people. So if someone had a different stature, it might be some different intervention that worked for them. And yeah, when you listen to the team that was involved in this, there's some really impressive results, and certainly some jumps were landed and skills were acquired that it certainly appears to be a kind of a something that's been able to accelerate their learning in this space. And I think it's a really good example of how simulation can be used in quite a complicated skill or complicated application, but could be really powerful. And I guess the natural evolution of that, and it's something that was explored, has been explored within cycling, is that you can go from a segment level. So in here, you can look to optimize or to simulate the segment position and posture, which is what they had in the skating example. And you can start to create models of muscles, and this is what we've got on the left-hand side. And this is something that was done within cycling. And you essentially create a muscle level simulation, and at that point you can start to explore questions such as should we look to try and increase the strength and power of the quadriceps muscles on the front of the leg, or should we look to try and prioritize development of the hamstring muscles on the rear of the leg? And you can imagine that trying to take an experimental approach to address that question would be very difficult, short of having kind of identical twins born and trained over time, which maybe that is the alternative. But through having a digital twin and a simulation means that you can get some really good insights on those kind of questions in a far less invasive or a far less invasive manner. Okay, right. I thought whilst it's good to talk how simulations are, or how much they could be used certainly within a sporting context, it's really important to also talk through some learned experiences of using this. So I've always been a huge fan of simulation throughout my career. However, I've probably done almost every mistake known to man in terms of trying to apply that into given circumstances. So this is I thought it was worth to step through those, and potentially there are some equivalent challenges or lessons to be learned in other fields, potentially utilities as well. So one of the first ones I always reflect on is this point that in general, I think it's always good to remind yourself as someone who's pushing the use of digital twins or simulations that it's far better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. And I think one of the things with a digital simulation or a system that you've captured in a digital sense is that you can kid yourself by the number of decimal places that you can work to. And you can say, oh yeah, we know that this, or we can predict that this rider's going to complete this race in 0.005 of a second, or 2.005 of a second. And I guess in general, as a general point, I think it's far better to, rather than say we think the answer is 4.732, you should really say that it's somewhere between 4 and 5. And the reason that you should say that is because these models are actually wrong. They are full of assumptions, and they just capture the essence of the system. But there's a whole host of other things going on that you haven't captured, and so I think it's really important to factor in the potential ranges of outcomes, and to try and capture the natural variability that you would see in a system in order to anchor a conversation around something that's likely to be the right answer, or the region of the right answer, rather than trying to exactly hit the bullseye of what you think the precise answer is going to be. And a practical method that we would always try to use, I would always try to use to achieve that, is to essentially balance simulation data with real life data. So for example, if we look at simulation data, I think it's, I would say that the data are not real, that they're certainly not real, but they are repeatable, and it allows you to ask what if questions, which is the examples that I've talked through already. But by comparison, real life data, the real strength of it, it is real data. But in my world, real life data means either an experimental data that you've captured through a controlled experiment, or maybe just observational data that you've viewed how something is acting in real life, and you've monitored some information, and you have some essentially statistical information on how systems perform. But I guess the key point for us is that we would always want to try and approach topics from the middle ground, in saying that if we have simulation, if we say, okay, well, we believe that this helmet and this tyre and this wheel is the best outcome for this course, that's okay. But at the same time, try to balance that against, try to take the findings of that and do some field testing just to double check the outcome, and just to double check that's reflected in real life data. So to expand on that a little bit more as a specific example, so this is in the world of BMX, which is one of the Olympic disciplines within the cycling context. And if for anyone who's seen a world-class BMX race, it's lightning quick. They're hugely powerful, strong athletes. And as you can see, the start of the races goes down a very, very steep starting ramp. Top to bottom is around about 2.5 seconds. And by the time you've reached the bottom, the person at the front has got, I believe the statistic is, you've got an 80% chance of then going on to win the race. So it's a hugely important start, and the riders and the coaches will spend an enormous amount of time trying to optimize what happens across the start hill. And that was the performance question that we had when I was back at British Cycling, was how do we optimize the start to get to the bottom of the hill as quickly as possible to place our rider in the pole position for the rest of the lap. And the specific question that was coming out was whether or not being slightly heavier or being slightly lighter would be preferable. And there's good logical arguments as to both of those sides. So being slightly heavier would be good from the point of view of you have a larger gravitational pull from the top down. So that it kind of logic would suggest that that's a pretty good thing that you want. And being slightly heavier would have a bigger gravitational pull down, or and so either a heavier bike, heavier equipment, heavier rider, heavier helmet would be a good thing. We want to add weight. But by comparison, there's also the argument that being lighter would be better, because you're still trying to accelerate a mass from a stationary position, and in which case being lighter, for example, accelerating on a completely flat hill, for example, you'd want to, on a flat hill, accelerating on a flat straight of land, you would want to be as light as possible, because you're trying to overcome the inertia of the system, and being heavier is a bad thing. And so the question was, what do we want? Do we want to increase weight, or do we want to reduce weight? And what should we do? So clearly there's a question that's made for simulation. You can capture the essence of the problem fairly easily. And we produced a simulation, and it showed that it was, by a very small amount, we were predicting that it was better to be lighter. So it was better to be lighter, but the difference was I think 4 kilograms of additional weight, so quite a lot. 4 kilograms of reduced weight would equate to about 0.025 of a second. So a really, really small amount. Now, in the world of BMX, however, that is a hugely important amount. That puts you half a bike length ahead of your competitors, and you've gained they call it the whole shot, but you've gained the pole position at that point. And it's a really, really important a significant finding. But we really questioned ourselves at that point and thought, well, hope the maths is right, hope the assumptions in there are not wrong. And then decided that we couldn't trust it, and we needed to do some field testing. So what we did was to do some an experimental testing session with the riders, placed weight vests on them, and captured real life data. And we were pleased to see that at the end of it, we did end up with a very similar predicted outcome. Obviously, we couldn't reduce weight, but we just went in the opposite direction and added weight and saw what the impairment on performance would be. And it worked out again about 0.025 of a second. So we were very close with the prediction and the real life data. But I think if we hadn't have collected the real life data to support that prediction, we would have really questioned the strength of the message that we could give from the model. And so in general, I think it's really important to balance simulation data with real life data. A couple of final points in terms of being able to deploy innovations into a system effectively. And I think this is a point, and I'd always forget who actually said this quote, but I think it's a brilliant quote. So any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And ultimately a simulation or a digital twin is the very definition of a black box. You've created a black box of which someone's going to put some numbers into it, press go, and it's going to give an answer. And there is, unless you're part of the development of that black box, you've got no idea how it works, and you're essentially trusting a magic black box to try and tell you something about a system. You can understand why that's a potential. It's a difficult thing sometimes for end users or for people who haven't previously used simulations to then start to use. And there's a couple of points on here that I thought it was worth reflecting on, certainly within a sports context, and I guess it would be wanted to explore and discuss whether it would be appropriate in a utilities section as well. But this first point is I think an important one, is that my experience is that the adoption of innovation, the diffusion of innovation, if you will, is ultimately a social rather than a data-driven or an evidence-based activity. And that doesn't, in my experience, that doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily the technical background of the end user, that's just human nature. I think even scientists, technologists, engineers will always assess the credibility of the person delivering a message. We'll have a look at what their peers are doing. We'll make a judgment call on that information. And really, it's quite social. It's quite it's not always a strictly speaking a data-driven or an evidence-based judgment call that will then ultimately mean that someone will adopt a new practice like a simulation. So a practical approach, I think, that does help to try and encourage this sort of social or this not strictly speaking data-driven approach is to have people embedded, or kind of to have people embedded in the functional teams that are doing the work on the ground, rather than necessarily a specialist siloed team. So what do I mean by that? So I guess you could have a simulation team, a digital twin team within any given organization. You can choose that they are a centralized team that sits separate, so the people that are actually doing whatever the function is of the organization. So in a sports team, they would sit separate to coaches, or they would sit separate to race teams, but it's a centralized service that's available. Or you could choose to deploy a simulation engineer into the race team, and they could be part of the team. They could go to the races, they could interact with the people that are there. My experience is the second one is far more likely to be a successful adoption of an innovation, rather than having people that feel like they sit in a silo. They're the specialist experts in a room who are going to come and tell us something about something that they don't really understand the practicalities of doing it on the ground. So I think that's my personal experience, is that I think trying to embed people into the functional team of an organization, I think, is a really powerful tool to try and accelerate this adoption of any new approach, really. And the second one is, and I think it's a really good point that a colleague of mine always makes, is if someone isn't doing something that you think that they should do, the very first thing you should do is to understand why, rather than to try and impose your thinking onto someone else. And to understand why, I think you can then explore and understand what it is that you can do to then try and move forward together to try and get something adopted. And I say that because I think there's one of two things I think that often comes out of why people aren't using a new approach. So, for example, why aren't people using a simulation? Well, I think there's one of two things. Either they don't see the value of it, and if they don't see the value of it, they don't think they're going to get any insight, or they don't think knowing which is the best helmet or the best wheel, or whether the BMX rider needs to be heavier or lighter. They just don't see the value of it. And so at that point, your job as a person that ultimately thinks this is a good thing is to communicate the value of it. You know, if we did know that it was this helmet, it's probably about 10 seconds there on this curve. And actually, if you coupled it with the right wheel, there might be another 20 seconds. So they could save 30 seconds on that, and that would put them from 4th place to 1st place. But your job is to communicate the value of what it is that you're trying to do. However, that's not always the case. Sometimes people completely get it. They completely understand that knowing which is the right piece of equipment to use is a really valuable thing. It's just simply that the simulation or the tool requires far too much effort. So it crashes. I have to press 5 different buttons to get it to work. It's asking for my password 3 times. I have to go and search a database for some information to put back in. It's just too much hassle. I've got lots of other stuff to do. And as much as I know there's value in it, I just can't find the time or to make this work. And then in which case the approach changes dramatically, and your role is to then, or the job is then to change the process or to simplify the process so that actually it's a couple of clicks, the information is readily available, and it's good to go. And I think there are 2 different reasons as to why someone wouldn't use a simulation, and the approach or the action to take in response to that are fundamentally different. And I think it's really important. Okay, by my watch, I've just gone ever so slightly over, so I apologise for that. But I do thanks everyone for listening, and yeah, would really welcome any thoughts, comments, questions, critique even would be perfect. So I believe I'm back to you, Jess. That's me done.
Wow, thanks, Paul. That was really, really interesting. My personal favourite parts were obviously the quote that you presented. Better to be approximately right than precisely wrong is absolutely crucial. And then also some of the things that you mentioned, you probably didn't realise, but are really similar to some of the things that we sort of profess and try and put forward at One Spatial as well. So the idea of that social approach and trying to engage the end users in the process is something that we always try and do. So we follow agile working practices, which means that we always try and encourage when we're sort of doing the design and build of new innovations, new solutions, to have the end users in the room as part of that process. Because like you say, if they don't see the value, if they feel like the technology is almost being forced upon them, it's a lot harder to get them to adopt it later down the line. So yeah, lots of things that really resonated with me that you might not even have been aware of, that were ticking all the boxes. So Karen, I think, should be joining us on stage, and she's going to host our Q&A session. We've had quite a few through. So I'll start with the ones that are getting the most votes, if that's okay, and I'll put off and Karen can take over once she joins us. So how do you get the team to trust the data and the simulations?
Yeah, and I guess that's the final points was probably in relation to that. I think the key things I think are the ones that I mentioned on the final stage. So I think having people embedded within the team helps. There is one way that I've recently been thinking about it or looking at it is that I think you need to flex the specific approach or the specific basically how technical do you want to go and how hard do you want to go with something new. I think you need to flex in response to the audience that you're working with. And so for us, we'll have end users that are either quite technical and they're ex-scientists, or we'll have end users who are ex-scientists, or we'll have end users who are former cyclists, know a race inside and out and understand the world of cycling, but aren't necessarily technically minded in it per se. And I think that those two, you need to flex the approach. So you need to change the approach based on those two things, and that's partly to bridge the gap between you as the person delivering the message and the person that's receiving it. I think there needs to be something of a gap because you're a new person, or you're a person that's trying to deliver new information that they don't have. But the gap can never be so big that it's, if we've got some guys that are basically know cycling inside and out, and they've done however many tours of France, and they're in that world. But we introduced them to a guy, someone that's straight out of a university with a PhD in machine learning. That's a very, very, very difficult gap to bridge. And so I think you just need to be mindful of that and to sort of buddy people up accordingly.
And I guess that links back to, in your presentation, when you were talking about simulation data and the importance to mix that with real data. So at that point where you're confident in the simulation, you can bring them into it, and then you can really prove the value to them. So that's really interesting.
Yeah. And actually, sorry, Jess, but yeah, just on that point, the other one is to for the testing purpose. But if you sort of field testing to try and support the outcome of a simulation, the other thing that I think is very useful is to have like people involved in the testing. From our point of view, having ex-riders that have massive credibility with the actual riders in the team. And so you almost you kind of involve someone. So even if they're not involved in the process as the end user, they know that someone is sat around the table representing their view and from their works from their perspective. Don't know if I explained that very well.
No, absolutely. Yeah. We have the same in utilities, and we often call them sort of the super users. So they come in, they represent, and they can sort of get to know the technology, and then they go and talk to their other teams about how great it is, rather than someone from the back office sort of professing that they know all when they might not have actually even done that job in the first place. So the next question is, do you think it's best to consider everything as a whole? In our case, the network, in your case, I guess the whole race, or look at each component individually?
Yeah, really, like top down or bottom up. Really, really good question. I guess it was going to have to be a mix between the two. The problem is, I think that if you look at it at system level all the time, you can't really identify, or it's very difficult to then like everything relates to everything. So you're if you want to improve something, if you want to specifically improve something, I think it's difficult to look at it as a complete whole at all times. By comparison, if you do bottom up and you kind of look at it in discrete components, you sometimes miss the interactions with other bits and pieces of the system. So what we would probably try to do is go top down to identify that sensitivity analysis to say this is the parameter that we want to try and improve. So we do top down to start, and then take the parameter off into a separate group and go, right, the goal of this group is just to improve that parameter. Don't worry about the interactions between that and something else. I don't know if that translates to the utility world or not, but I think then there's a mix of you understand the system, but you're not always, because if you always thought about all of the interactions between a given component and everything else in the system, you'd probably drive yourself insane, wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many components involved in the entire network, and it differs from network to network. Like you say, there's all the real world things that then come into that as well. And I think that's really a good advice, to try and get a good balance. Otherwise, you're just going to get distracted, I think, by what really is making the difference.
So actually, yeah, and so I know I keep interrupting that, but to explain, to sort of expand on that a little bit. So, for example, we would have aerodynamicists who are solely responsible for improving the aerodynamic performance of our bike and riders. They don't concern themselves with how aerodynamics would actually also, or how what they're doing would also influence something else. But it's somebody's job, my job, or someone's similar to me's job, to piece that together and go, okay, this is the outcome of the aerodynamicist, this is the outcome of the of someone looking at tires, this is the outcome of that, and package it together. Like as a whole, this still, and I guess so. I'm probably looking at things from a system level, but then the people who are actually responsible for improving those given areas are actually looking at it on quite a discrete component level.
Absolutely. Karen, do you want to ask some questions? We've still got loads in the chat box to pick from.
Yes, I will do. This is a good one. Okay. Did you have to do double-blind tests so that riders' preconceptions don't affect it? For example, not telling them if they have slightly lighter or heavier equipment.
Yeah, really good. So we'd always try to do this. Sometimes it's difficult because yeah, a helmet's just, good luck trying to hide the shape of a helmet compared to one and the other. But for sure, we would try to do that. So for tyres, for tyre testing, we would try to cover the brand, the model of the tyre, so they wouldn't know. If you're changing someone's position on a bike, it's almost always better to try and do it where you change it and they don't know, they look the other way, and then they'd get on it, and you would test it in that way. That's okay if you've got a rider who is that way and almost like understands the process and buys into the process. That becomes far more difficult if it's someone's a little bit less trustworthy of what it is that you're doing. So yeah, human biases are massive, and then the human biases are massive within cycling. So people will just like equipment, they become linked to something, and they kind of and that's not to dismiss what they're feeling, because it's almost certainly something in it, but at the same time we try as much as possible to remove it. Double blind, I mean, I'd say it's not peer reviewed quality. It's not a million miles away from peer reviewed quality, but it's not like a double blind sort of, not a sort of a medical, validation level assessments. But we try where we can to try and work in that way.
Okay, this is a good one. What do you find is the best way to showcase an innovation to an end user? So I guess something very prominent in the utilities industry. What do you think is the best way to get across to that end user?
I think you probably picked up on it before a little bit. Maybe you have like champions of it, so that like key opinion leaders with any. And I think if you get a key opinion leader on board with something, you almost don't need to say anything at that point. And so I think if we have significant senior. It's often the riders, but if it doesn't have to be, it could also be a coach or something. Like if they're on board with something and they're kind of quite, they're renowned as being pretty tough on things, or they're quite, they do their homework. And if they're on board, they're using it. I think the point when if you're trying to sell something, I almost wonder if you've lost the battle a little bit at that point anyway. I don't know. It's an interesting. I think there's a balance between promoting. Like you want people to know about something, but the second that it feels, certainly within our world, that you're trying to push something against someone's interest, it's a difficult one. So I'd go key opinion leaders first, and then. So
you need that natural buy-in. You shouldn't have to feel as though you have to sell it. You need to have that confidence in it before you're getting to that point where you're, thinking, right, what is my selling strategy going to be essentially?
And I guess if you. Obviously you're in a situation where it's so performance based, and they're all individually trying to do the best they possibly can. If you've got one rider that's a bit resistant to the process, and then another rider that's working with you, and then they start getting better results, I guess that sort of gives them the motivation in itself to want to sort of get on board with the team a bit more.
For sure, but then you always have to be mindful that it can work the other way, and through if it again it's in a systems level, lots of things can, people can win or lose based off lots of different reasons, even if there's a certain part of it that is good or bad. And so I think it's always good. It's a difficult one to link yourself really strongly to the outcome, because I've been in teams that I've won and knowing that underneath it's not great, and I've vice versa been in teams when underneath is great and actually the outcome just hasn't happened for whatever reason. But yes, as a general point, it's when people are winning and they're working within in a space that you'd like them. Yeah, that definitely helps. It's just when it goes the other way, and I've been there when it goes the other way, and it's kind of you're really trying to push something, and it's gone, and the end result has been bad. And then in that case, I guess you do at that point just need to relook up the models that you use, the assumptions that you've made. The kind of, is your thinking actually right at that point, which is not always the most comfortable thing, but it's reality.
Time for one more question, and I'm going to ask this one because it seems to be from someone who's into cycling, so it seems to the best field test ever, Chris Froome on stage 19 of the Giro. Did you really simulate that?
I must, because so I wasn't at the team at that point, so I can't really answer that too much. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm trying to think what underpinned. There was definitely, I don't think it would have really been a simulation that would have done it, but some very, very strong, like logical thinking. And the people that were involved had a very clear, like deterministic understanding of what was required to make that performance. So for those that you don't know, yeah, this was a famous stage where there was a huge attack on a stage, and he gained a massive amount of time. That was almost like one of the most exciting stages in sort of modern Grand Tour racing history. But that was underpinned by an understanding of fueling, for example, and that was the deterministic understanding. So I guess in many ways you could argue that, and I hope I'm not trying to draw too many links here that shouldn't be made. It was definitely a deterministic understanding that underpinned that performance. And in a similar way, it's a deterministic understanding of a system that allows you to generate a simulation. So it was kind of a systems of deterministic thinking that underpinned it. But my understanding was, yeah, because that was a few years ago now, I don't think there was necessarily, there was actually digital twins running in the background for that one.
Brilliant. That was fantastic. Thank you very much, Paul. There are more questions. Paul, are you able to stick around for a bit? I guess if people want to chat to you, they can use the chat function.
Yeah, no problem.
Message to answer all the questions that are in there. There's still absolutely loads, but we have run out of time, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. Again, that was brilliant.